Lesson 6, workflow properties. So now we finished creating a workflow itself. And you saw that we opened up, when we hit create workflow, we opened up a big dialog that had a lot of properties on it. So now we're going to talk about those properties in depth, and we're going to explain to you what each of those properties are and what they mean. So let's jump over to the software and take a look at this. Now I'm going to go up to the workflow menu and follow along with the workflow that we just created. I'm going to edit it and bring it up in the editor. So here are all of the properties that we have on this workflow. Now remember, the workflow itself is a logical container for all the processes that we're working on. So the first thing that we have available is the name, and you can change the name of a workflow simply by changing the name here, the name column. You can add some comments. This is a sample workflow, not very articulate today. And we have the next one here is the integration service. Now, the integration service is actually the piece that does all the work. Remember our architectural diagram from our architectural lessons. Let's talk about that for just a second. We're sitting over here. This is the server component. Let's take a look at the client component. We're sitting on the client on the Windows box. And we're sitting in the workflow manager, which I'm going to abbreviate. And we're editing properties. Now we're telling it something about an integration service. That integration service actually lives over here on the server side. This is the repository server, which talks to the repository database. And I can't draw databases very well, so forgive me on that one. And then over here we've got the integration service. The integration service, you can have one or more integration services on the same server. Each one of these integration services is responsible for running the jobs that you design in your client base and you store in the repository with the metadata. So this is where we're configuring the integration service. Now, keep in mind that the integration service may live on the same server as the repository. It may live on a different server. It may be over here on, this might be Mickey Mouse and this might be Minnie Mouse in case you were naming services. So you could put the integration service on a separate server completely and run all of your jobs over here, have it connect up to this repository and this repository server. So these are just some of the things that we're thinking about. Now, when you have a gridded environment, we'll cover the gridded environment in a whole nother course. That gets a little deeper than we want to go right now. But this is the integration service. So if your administrator has set it up, you can actually browse different integration services. Be careful. You can assign a job to a production integration service, but Informatica's security model will keep you from running that job in production if you don't have the privileges. So make sure, usually the default integration service is assigned for the repository that you're working in. And usually the repository you're working in is development, which is a good thing. Don't delete the integration service. You definitely don't want to do that, or the job won't run at all. Suspension email. If your workflow goes into a suspend mode, meaning an error happened and you told the workflow suspend on error, then in this case, once it hits suspend, you can choose an email task. You can hit this button, bring up the email, and it will send an email saying, I've gone into suspension mode, and you can send it some details. Now, I haven't created any email tasks. They have to be reusable in order for me to assign an email in a suspension mode. Runtime options, disabled, and here is the checkbox, suspend on error. It doesn't do you any good to set up a suspension email, but not turn on suspend on error. Because obviously, if there's an error and it doesn't suspend, you'll never get an email, right? Okay, I figured you knew that. So, disabled. What does disabled do? Sometimes we have the workflow in a set of schedules. And we don't want to change the entire schedule, especially if we're using an external scheduling engine. We want the scheduling engine to continue to process everything. So we want it to issue a start workflow command. But if you turn on disable, it disables the workflow from running at all. And so it goes ahead and responds to the start workflow command, but it responds by saying, I'm disabled. And so that's what the disabled switch does. Web services. If you are licensed, number one, and if you have installed and configured it, number two, you can use web services. Now, if you turn on web services, you see it there, even though if you're not licensed, you still see it, and you try to configure it. If you're not licensed, then at runtime it'll tell you not licensed for web services. So just be careful. That's a runtime problem. The web services allow you to connect up to web services. In fact, the Apache web server and a few other things allow those to happen. Configure concurrent execution. Now, this is kind of nice. What you can do with concurrent execution is you can start multiple copies of this workflow and run them in parallel. So that's what the configure or concurrent execution does for you. Load balancing. If you have a grid, and again, partitioning or high availability, a grid system or high availability installed in Informatica, which is challenging to configure. But if you have it, and if it's running, then you can actually do load balancing. You can tell this entire workflow, hey, Informatica, when you're running this piece, or once you start this piece, you decide where to ship these sessions off, or maybe you've already told this session runs on this service, these sessions run on that service, and this workflow is just load balanced. So there's a number of different ways you can set up load balancing, which we cover in the grid configuration course. Properties. Let's take a look at the workflow properties. Parameter file name is the first property. So in parameter file name, you can actually feed parameter variables into the workflow. Now there's a whole section that we go through on variable definition in another lesson. So we're going to leave that for now, but we will come back to this particular piece later. Write backward compatible workflow file. That should say workflow log, and there it is. If you turn that on, it'll write a text log file to your workflow log directory. Otherwise, it writes a binary log. And you may have noticed the .bin extensions appearing in your log directory. Those are only open or can be opened by the administration console. Those reside on the server when you run the job. They do not reside on your client. From there, you can control the directory. And some people say, well, you know what, I've got different groups using my Informatica environment, so they develop a naming convention and a naming standard, and you can prefix all of those things. Save session workflow log by runs or by timestamp. If you turn this on by runs and you say, well, I want to save the past 5 runs, it will name the workflow log _1, _2, _3, _4, _5. Excuse me. And then when it gets back to the 6th one, it'll iterate, it'll roll over back to workflow _1. So that's by runs. If you leave it at 0, it saves only 1 run and overwrites the log file every single time. Obviously, if you use timestamp, it just sticks a timestamp on and it never overwrites. So you have to manage the directory and clean out the files if you're going to use by timestamp. HA recovery. If you have purchased the high availability option, you can turn this on and configure HA recovery. I'm not going to go through it in the basics class. The scheduler. The workflow has a scheduler component, and over here on the right, we've got a scheduler button, which if you click it, you can bring up a schedule task, and you can call this schedule, name this schedule, you can make it reusable. The scheduler allows you to run on demand, run on a particular integration service when it's rebooted. You can run continuously. You can set up a schedule. Now, somebody says to me, well, you just clicked on run on integration service, but then the schedule enabled. How do I get to run it on a schedule? Well, this is what we call a radio box check button, right? If you turn off the check button, you notice that all of a sudden the schedule options appear, and this is what we call run on schedule. What we should have is a radio button. These should all be 4 radio buttons, and we should have run on schedule as an option to click on. So that's how the scheduler works. We're going to discard the changes. Variables in the workflow are associated with parameter files. We'll get to those later. Events in the workflow as well. When we get to the event section, we're going to define a few for you, and we're going to help you through the event section. Metadata extensions, those were defined in the designer section. All the same rules apply to metadata extensions on the workflow that applied to the source object when we created the author metadata extension. So that brings us to a close on all of the properties of a workflow.